I'm Natasha Kirchuk, and this is Middle East Now. Let's take a look at today's headlines. Israel destroys the Syrian military fleet amid a reported broad campaign of strikes on Syria's weapons arsenal across the country. We have the details. And thousands of displaced Syrian refugees are making their way back to Syria following the fall of the al-Assad regime. Plus, Qatar has resumed its role as a mediator in negotiations for a ceasefire and hostage release deal in the Gaza Strip. We'll break down what this means for the future. Israeli naval ships have destroyed the Syrian military fleet in an operation last night that has been confirmed by the Israeli defense minister in what appears to be part of a broader campaign to eliminate strategic threats to the state of Israel. Now, this comes as the Israeli Air Force reportedly carried out about 300 strikes in Syria early this morning, most of which were in southern Syria and around the city of Damascus, targeting Syrian army bases and weapons depots. Officially, at this point, we have seen that officials have made it clear that they've seized control of the buffer zone between Israel and Syria to prevent potential threats from emerging against Israeli civilians in northern Israel. Take a listen.
The IDF has been operating in Syria in recent days to strike and destroy strategic capabilities that threaten the state of Israel. The Navy operated last night to destroy the Syrian fleet, and with great success. I hereby warn the rebel leaders in Syria. Whoever follows Assad's path will end up like Assad. We will not allow an extremist Islamic terrorist entity to act against Israel across its border, and at the risk of its citizens, we will do everything necessary to remove the threat.
We are continuing to see Israeli movements and bombardments into Syrian territory. This needs to stop.
Joining us from the Golan Heights is our correspondent Emmanuel Honorat. Emmanuel, what is the latest? What directions have citizens been getting from the Homefront Command, and what kind of military movement are we seeing right now?
So far, no directions from the Homefront Command. And I can tell you, Natasha, just driving up here, we did actually see quite a few tanks and soldiers, also buses with soldiers coming up here. And in fact, around me, quite a few soldiers also circulating. So there is a sense of sort of heightened activity, but no definite regulations so far from the Homefront Command for civilians. And in fact, the IDF also saying that it struck around 320 targets in Syria. That's between 70 to 80% of what they estimated to be the targets of Syrian army forces, saying that they have destroyed most of what they believe to be could have been targets if fallen into the wrong hands with all of the new changes with the leadership coming into Syria. And of course, with everything going on, there is so many moving parts, and we are also hearing of conflicting reports of IDF movement in Syrian territory. Now, of course, the IDF did deny this, saying that it is basically mainly interested in securing its positions in the buffer zone separating Israel and Syria, and intended to mostly secure that border, making sure that none of the conflict in Syria seeps into Israeli territory. Natasha.
All right, Emmanuel, thanks for joining us. We're going to be turning now to our Middle East correspondent, Ariel Osran. So, I just kind of want you to briefly explain why the buffer zone exists.
Well, it exists following the Armistice Agreement 1974, following the Yom Kippur War. Israel had conquered the Golan Heights in the Six-Day War. Syria tried to recapture it in the Yom Kippur War of 73. Failed. Israel actually even extended its control over some of the areas there, and since 1974 the area has been under a UN armistice agreement with a buffer zone, and basically in that buffer zone there were areas that in terms of the topography, strategic importance, could potentially endanger Israel, but they also overlook, if you look into Syria, then you can observe the areas there. So what Israel's doing is seizing those strategic points that overlook not only southern Syria, but also protect the border with Israel in order to prevent any elements who might want to endanger Israeli communities there. Now,
this is essentially out of concern that, you know, the deal is no longer going to be in play. Assad is out of power. So the question now is how these rebel groups are ultimately going to handle this.
To prevent a free-for-all in the area, or the free-for-all is in play, and Israel was the first element to kind of claim its stake over the area, saying that these are temporary measures in order to prevent not only Syrian rebels, but we know that in Syria there are amassed tens of thousands of pro-Iranian militias. Now Iran is saying now that they have no fighters there, but we know that over the past few years, and especially specifically since this October 7th of last year, there have been many pro-Iran or Iranian-aligned elements who have amassed in those areas, and in order to prevent any scenario of storming into Israel and carrying out an October 7th-like rampage on Israeli communities. So Israel had in recent months quietly operated in the buffer zone, making changes in the land to make it more challenging for such onslaughts to originate from the area. But now they're going pretty much all in, you can say, into the buffer zone, seizing control of that area. There are Syrian communities in those places, but as far as Israel's concerned with its engagement with the locals there, asking them to stay at home, not to go out, as to not deemed as potential threats to Israel.
So that, of course, leads me to my next question. What responses are we actually hearing from these Syrian rebel groups, you know, when it comes to the buffer zone and also the Israeli strikes that we're seeing across Syria, which, of course, have primarily not been confirmed by the Israeli government, but you know, it's not hard to believe that Israel would very much have an interest in taking out potential weapons arsenals that could fall into the wrong hands.
Look, since the fall of the Assad regime just a couple of days ago, Israel has carried out close to 400 airstrikes, strikes also from the air, also from the sea, on regime military sites, also research sites, intelligence sites, chemical weapons sites, with the goal of basically preventing anything from landing in the hands of anyone who could seek to harm Israel. As Emmanuel said, 70 to 80% of the Syrian Air Force is no longer existent. And basically, this is the most significant wave of airstrikes that we've seen the IDF carry out in Syria in such a short time span ever, some could say. But we're not hearing any condemnation, any reaction from the Syrian rebels regarding neither the ground operation nor the airstrikes. Mum's the word on that front. At the end of the day, strategically, this benefits them. It does prevent strategic weapons from advanced weapons from ending up in their hands. But at the end of the day, at least they're claiming that they never sought to obtain such weapons. And by Israel's current bombings, they are being removed from the equation. That is not something that
But it's also Iranian militia hands that these arms could fall into as well. It's not just these rebel groups that Israel is concerned about. So that's you know, another element of this. But of course, the question is what these rebel groups have said just generally in terms of their stance towards the state of Israel. Obviously, we've seen some videos going viral of members of HTS, although obviously these are elements. It's not an official statement saying that, you know, this rampage is going to be continued to Jerusalem and even Mecca.
Yeah, so that was an interesting statement. Look, these are 10 guys with a video camera and an Islamist flag. That doesn't indicate that that is the sentiment throughout the entire Hayat Tahrir Hashem. I think there are more than 10 people, but this isn't the significant part of this leading rebel faction. But yes, at the end of the day, this is not a homogenous group. This is not a singular group with one shared ideology. You have a variety of different factions cooperating together. Some places better, some places not smoothly, but under the leadership of Abu Muhammad al-Julani or Ahmad al-Shara. He's even trying to rebrand not only himself, but the entire group that he leads, to try and show that not only are they not ISIS, they're fighting ISIS, but they're not Al-Qaeda. Now, you have seen in videos of HTS forces liberating some of the Syrian communities, some of the big cities with patches of ISIS, but this is a minority. This does present a threat, and this is one of the biggest challenges moving forward for the international community, cooperating and even accepting such a rule from such elements. But at the end of the day, in terms of the statements from the leadership, we are not hearing anything that can be seen as immediate threats on Israel.
Well, there's obviously certainly an interest on the part of these rebel groups also, especially HTS, to be removed from the terror list, you know, that they've been deemed a terror group by the U.S., the UN, other international powers, and to kind of have any type of legitimacy as leaders of Syria. That's certainly not going to be in their interest to remain on that list. But I just want to ask you one last question before we move on. I understand that you have spoken to someone who has lived under HTS rule in Idlib for the last 7 years. What did he have to say, and what does that indicate about what kind of leadership we can expect from HTS, if at all?
Right. So really just a few minutes before I came into studio, I got off the phone with a man from Idlib who went to Damascus as the forces arrived there, to witness the revolutions, in his words, the fall of the decades-long dictatorship of the Assad regime. He is hopeful that this will be a dawn of a new age for Syria, that they will be a free, democratic Syria that will be tolerant of all walks of life and all groups in the country. And very interestingly, he called for good relations with all neighboring countries, including Israel. Regarding what we talked about just a few minutes ago, he said that he does not want to see continued airstrikes by Israel on Syrian military sites, saying that many of this weaponry is outdated, and at the end of the day, there is concern among Syrians that the continuation and expansion of this offensive could endanger them. As for life under HTS, it is in many respects, it is under religious law, but not the stifling, abusive dictatorship that you could see under ISIS. These elements, at the end of the day, they controlled the day-to-day rule of Idlib and those areas, limited freedom of expression, no social services because it was humanitarian organizations running the show. Very fascinating stuff. We'll bring more details of these testimonies tomorrow.
Okay. All right. Well, Israel appears to be ramping up military operations targeting security threats in Syria. We're already seeing a chorus of international outrage. Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and Egypt are just some of the regional neighbors that are accusing Israel of exploiting the current situation in Syria for its own benefit. In the meantime, Western powers are urging restraint. And joining us now is former senior advisor in the U.S. State Department, Hazem Al-Gabra. Hazem, no matter what, Israel was bound to receive backlash for really any advances into the buffer zone or strikes in Syria, despite what could pose clear security threats to its own sovereignty. What do you make of Israel's military decision-making at this point, and whether or not it's a good move going forward?
Good afternoon. First of all, myself and other analysts here in Washington are convinced this is not an operation that was decided overnight. This is something that was planned for a month. Obviously, irrelevant if the Assad regime fell or not, there was a need by Israel to destroy an air force and weapons that do threaten Israel from Syria under the Assad regime. Obviously, what happened in the past few days may have expedited that decision, but obviously the arsenal in Syria poses a threat, has always posed a threat to Israel. That said, the criticism here is there's a bit of a failure of messaging and maybe a failure of imagination from the Israeli side. The messaging should have been clear. I personally see a silver lining to this. The Syrian people do not need weapons at this point. They need to build a nation. They do not need to be engaged using weapons to engage in wars internally or with each other or with neighboring countries or other nations. However, the messaging did not exist from Israel, and the narrative was hijacked by Qatar's Al Jazeera and Iran's Al Mayadeen TV, and they went on air claiming that Israel is making moves to take over Syria and take over territory in Syria, even though we don't believe that's the case here. Also, the failure of imagination here is it seems that the atmosphere in Israel is that HTS and these elements have taken over the country irreversibly. I do not think that's the situation here. I think the Syria as a nation is still in play. Israel is emerging as a superpower in that region. It should not look at what's happening as a threat only, but as an opportunity to win the hearts and minds of the Syrian people and be an active participant in rebuilding Syria. I think the Syrian people are sick and tired of the war and are looking for partners and friends. Right. And remember, the main force that has been telling the Syrian people Israel is your enemy is gone. It was the Syrian regime. It was the Assad regime. Also, the Syrian people share a narrative right now with the Jewish people. Obviously, we have our own Auschwitz in Syria named Sidnaya prison. So there is more in common right now than the average person may imagine. And finally, I would really, really like to see Syrian, Israeli Jewish rabbis that were exiled from Syria in the 90s go back to visit Damascus in the near future.
Now, so far, HTS and the other rebel groups involved in the overthrow of the Assad regime have not explicitly threatened Israel. We have seen some members of these groups calling to continue their rampage all the way to Jerusalem, all the way to Mecca. Can we expect that to change? I mean, how worried should Israel be about this? Of course, we know that HTS is still designated a terror group according to the U.S., the UN, other international powers. And can we expect this to change if they do stick by their promises not to implement draconian Islamist laws?
It's a pray for the best, prepare for the worst kind of situation right now. We don't know. I don't think they know. I don't think Ahmad Shara, the leader of the group, knows how much grip that he has over the group at large and the other fighting groups and their interests. I think the messaging has been good so far, especially on foreign relations and relations with neighbors. But as you've also mentioned correctly, there are voices within that group that are pure jihadist voices. And unfortunately, these groups have not really governed before, not fully at least. They have a very limited experience in Idlib, at least Ashar does. But governing a nation the size of Syria is a complex matter. We hope that we can support them in governing, not necessarily Shara, but whomever becomes the leadership and the civilian leadership of the country. So people will get more involved and interested in the success of governing than fighting, because a lot of these groups we've seen when they take over power, they go into perpetual fighting. The Iranian regime is one of those examples. They took power. They failed to build a good economy, a modern education system, and they seem always more interested in continuing a fight they started decades ago.
Ultimately, is there any type of consensus by the Syrian public at this point as to who they would want to see lead the country?
The Syrian people are incredibly tired. They're fatigued. They're left with a destroyed country. Syria, make no mistake, Syria is a highly damaged country. It's a destroyed country when it comes to the economy, when it comes to society, when it comes to politics. This country has been run on corruption for the past several decades. So I think they are interested in peace right now. I mean, who wouldn't be after so much war?
Right.
I think they want economic stability. And I tell you right now, immediately, they need heating fuel because the country is running out of diesel fuel for heat, for home heating, and winter is here.
Yeah. All right. Well, Hazem, I'd like to thank you so much for joining us. Really interesting to hear your take on this. We know now that Syria's new interim leader, Mohammed al-Bashir, has announced that he's going to be taking charge of the country as caretaker prime minister with the backing of the former rebels who toppled Assad. He says that he's going to lead the interim authority until March 1st. Take a listen.
Today we held a cabinet meeting that included a team from the Salvation Government that was working in Idlib and its vicinity, and the government of the ousted regime. The meeting was under the headline of transferring the files and institutions from the government of the ousted regime to the transitional government in order to receive these files and conduct business. This means that there will be a Syrian government that will handle these files and manage the business during the transitional period, God willing, that may end on March the 1st. The General Command has tasked us with running the transitional government until March the 1st, 2025.
Well, joining us now is our Middle East correspondent, Ariel Osran, once again. Turning back to you, who is Mohammed al-Bashir?
He was the prime minister since January 1st of this year. Since January, governing, he was the prime minister of the Salvation Government. That is the autonomous government that was put in place by HTS in northwestern Syria, mainly the Idlib area, since 2017. And this is also what differentiates HTS from other Islamist jihadist groups, that they seek to govern their own people and not expansionists establishing caliphate with draconian Sharia law. They didn't really provide daily services because of the current situation, as we heard from Hazem break down very eloquently. A lot of reliance on international organizations, foreign aid. But at the end of the day, this is the closest thing to an autonomous governance, irrespective of the Kurdish semi-autonomy that you had in eastern Syria. This is, and they're trying to take this format, this formula, and extend it to all of Syria. The only thing is, Idlib is not Syria. The challenges are very different. The society is a lot more heterogeneous, a lot more different factions with different ideologies. But one thing is in common, and we also heard that from Hazem, the fatigue from war. The Syrians are ready to turn a new page on their history, to rebuild their country with their own hands. And from what we've seen in areas, for instance, in Latakia, that you had all the different sects, the leaders of the different sects meet together and reach agreements. They can do that with the proper discourse. And now with the cloud of the Bashar government regime, Iranian influence in Syria, now they have the opportunity to seize their future in their own hands, and they really want to do that. Absolutely. And there obviously are many, many challenges, but at the end of the day, this is going to be a day-to-day issue with Syria.
Well, hundreds of Syrian refugees are gathering at Turkey's southern border crossings to make their way home following the collapse of Bashar al-Assad's government. Many fled Syria as long as 13 years ago, following the outbreak of the Syrian civil war in 2011, and at least 3 million Syrians have been living in Turkey. Now, the fall of al-Assad has sparked major celebrations among this community, and have a listen to what some have to say.
I have just come from Istanbul, and I am going to Damascus, God willing. And I am going to work in the house after everything is over and the regime has fallen. May God curse Hafez Assad's soul. And there is nothing left, thank God.
I was working in Antalya in Stonewall construction. Thank God Assad is gone. I am going to Aleppo. It is safe now. There's no problem. We're going to go back.
Well, joining us now from Istanbul, Turkey, is Yusuf Erim. He is a TRT World's editor at large. Now, Turkey has been home to 3 million Syrian refugees for years now following the start of the Syrian civil war. How will the repatriation of this refugee community back home impact Turkey, and how is the public reacting?
Well, the public obviously is looking at it from a positive perspective. One, they're happy for the Syrians that after such a long time that they're having the opportunity to go back home. there was some disgruntlement amongst the public after so many years having 4 million Syrians, which basically equates to about 5% of the population being introduced into Turkish society into such a small period. Obviously, it stressed the social fabric of the country. But I think for better or worse, Turkey did a good job providing public services for all these refugees. But we are now seeing the first wave of refugees wanting to return back home. But I think it's kind of a wait and see perspective for these refugees. Once they see the transition government put some success, we might see more refugees flows. But from a Turkish economy perspective, obviously there's going to be a shortage of labor coming in the next couple of months. A lot of homes now going to be vacated. So we might see a dip in housing prices impacting the Turkish economy positively. Wages might be going up, impacting the economy negatively. So there's going to be these impacts. It's going to be interesting to see how the economy is going to deal with it. But also, you're having this brain drain from Syria returning back. So that's going to be really important in this very critical period when the government's looking to transition to a political solution process, build a more permanent government. So having these skilled people come back to Syria is very critical for them.
Right. Of course, there are also many members of the Syrian refugee community who say that, there's a chance that they are going to find themselves going back to Turkey, that they've had an overall good experience living in Turkey. And again, they don't know what awaits them. So we're going to have to see what the numbers actually end up being. But, I'd like to talk about Turkey's involvement in the downfall of the Assad regime right now. We know that the Syrian National Army is backed by Turkey, largely because of its efforts to push back Kurdish militants from the Syrian border with Turkey. How involved was Turkey in this?
Well, we have to remember that Turkey has been preparing these proxies for many, many years. I mean, they've trained them, they've equipped them, they've given them the strategy, they've given them the intelligence. I mean, the level of Turkey's involvement in this exact operation, depending on proxy to proxy, it could be a lot, it could be very little. But when you look at the 5 to 6 to 7 year period that they've had a relationship with these groups, obviously Turkey has had a tremendous impact. You look at the fighting prowess of these proxies back in 2017, 2018, versus where they are now, the equipment they have now, the discipline they have now, it's like night and day. And obviously Syria is going to need these well-trained fighters to form the backbone of their military and security services and law enforcement. So it was tremendously important. And I just want to make one note about the refugees. I was listening in. I noticed many of them were speaking Turkish in the background rather than Arabic. And also important to note that there's a lot of children who were born on Turkish soil who are actually going to be seeing Syria for the very first time in their lives.
All right. Well, I'd like to thank you so much for joining us. Interesting to hear your take on this. I'm sure that we're going to have you back on the show soon with more Turkish perspective. We're turning now to ISIS. The fall of Syrian President Bashar al-Assad has ushered in a new chapter for the war-torn country, but it's also raising fears of a possible resurgence of the Islamic State. The terrorist group, though diminished, thrives in chaos, and Syria's fragile political transition presents a golden opportunity for the Islamic State to regroup. Here's more on that growing concern.
Bashar al-Assad's ouster by rebel forces has marked the end of a decades-long regime, but has also created a power vacuum that experts warn could benefit the Islamic State, or ISIS. Though its so-called caliphate was crushed in 2019, the group has never fully disappeared. ISIS cells remain scattered across Syria's eastern desert. Their survival is a testament to the instability that has plagued the country for over a decade. The fall of Assad adds a new layer of uncertainty, and ISIS thrives in such conditions. ISIS is one of the most dangerous terrorist organizations in modern history. At its peak, it controlled territory the size of the UK across Iraq and Syria, imposed a brutal regime based on extremist interpretations of Islamic law, and carried out atrocities including mass executions, slavery, and the destruction of cultural heritage sites. Its global network orchestrated or inspired hundreds of attacks worldwide, including in Europe, the US, and the Middle East. Beyond its military capabilities, ISIS has mastered propaganda, using social media to recruit fighters and spread its ideology globally. inspiring lone wolf attackers abroad.
ISIS will try to use this period to reestablish its capabilities, to create safe havens. We have a strong interest in preventing the reemergence of ISIS, given the death and destruction that it's wrought for so long.
Shortly after Assad's regime was declared collapsed, the United States launched a series of airstrikes targeting over 75 ISIS positions in Syria, aiming at preventing the group from re-establishing its foothold. But challenges remain. Overcrowded detention camps holding thousands of ISIS fighters and their families are seen as a ticking time bomb. One such camp, Al-Hol, has been a hotspot for radicalization and unrest. Experts warn ISIS may exploit Syria's instability to stage mass prison breaks, as they did in 2022. While rebels now control Damascus, their vision of a civil, democratic Syria stands in stark contrast to ISIS' radical ideology. For the terror group, this is not just an opportunity, but a call to action, with its propaganda positioning it as the only true Islamic authority.
Well, joining us now is journalist Osama Mohammed, who is based in Qamishli in Syria. Now, how concerned should the world be about an Islamic State resurgence following the downfall of the Assad regime, in your opinion?
Thank you for having me. First of all, let's remember that there was a lot of top leaders of ISIS could escape from northeast Syria during the last battle in Baghuz in 2019 and before. A lot of them could reorganize themselves in northwest Syria, in Idlib, in Jarablus and Azaz, and they were looking to have a chance to reappear and reorganize themselves and control some areas with the support of their sleeper cells who are separated in northeast Syria. So this is a main thing that ISIS never end. ISIS was existed. They were controlling from northwest Syria. A lot of times you have been seen on media too that there was a special operations by international coalition with the support of SDF to eliminate a lot of top ISIS leaders in northwest Syria. So ISIS was never end. Actually. Second thing is that now there is a big gap, as you mentioned, and vacuum. In the prisons in northeast Syria, there is more than 10,000 ISIS fighters who could be detained or arrested by the international coalition and SDF, and they are now in prisons in northeast Syria. We remember that there was one prison break 2 years ago, and there was like hundreds of people who were killed by this prison break. So the risk of reappearance and show of ISIS is high, and mostly with this vacuum, which we could see now. To add on this, there is the radical groups who are now fighting against the Kurds and SDF in Manbij. Now they are almost in the bridge where they are trying to go to Kobane, which is considered one of the main symbolic cities for all the Kurds, and actually it's symbolic for the whole war too. It was the first city where ISIS was defeated. Right. So yes, there is a high risk that ISIS can reorganize themselves and control cities in whole Syria through their sleeper cells and through the support of these radical groups who were actually organized long time ago until now in northwest Syria.
Yeah. I kind of want to change the subject slightly here. Israeli planes have reportedly bombed at least 3 former Syrian regime army air bases that housed dozens of helicopters and jets in Qamishli. How are the Kurds reacting to the increase in strikes on Kurdish-held territory, even if they aren't the target?
Well, what we could see on media that this targets was actually made by Israel, or maybe it's by the coalition too, but it was bombing of the ammunitions and weapons which was in the airport. So this ammunition and these weapons were under the control of regime until the day before yesterday. And yesterday at night, there was a high bombing of this, heavy bombing of these places to destroy all of this ammunitions in the airport.
How can we...
For the Kurdish people, for the Kurdish people, I don't think that there was any high risks on that. We know that there was a long time ago. There is still bombing by the international coalition, by the Israel of the places where the Hezbollah with their Iranian militias were based.
Which brings me to my next question. How can we expect the rebel groups who have toppled the Assad regime to behave towards the Kurds, especially since the Syrian National Army, for one, is backed by Turkey with a clear interest in pushing Kurdish militants away from the Turkish border?
As I mentioned at the beginning too, I think these radical groups want to get revenge from the Kurdish people, first of all, because, it's very known and common that the Kurds were the first one who could defeat the most terrorist organization in the world, ISIS. So now the eyes are on Kobani. There is hashtag which is going highly now, which is called Save Kobani. Most of the Kurdish people in Kobani now, they are preparing themselves, preparing their properties, equipments, and they are ready to, or they are trying to leave the city. There is no any statement from international coalition, not from Russians, not from anybody, to say that we're going to support the SDF in their fighting against these radical groups if they try to come to Kobani. So this is very sensitive time. I think should be a statement, a clear statement by the international coalition, by US, that we are supporting our backed allies who fight with us against ISIS in this unfair battle in Kobani now.
All right. I'd like to thank you so much for joining us. Very interesting to hear your perspective, and stay safe.
Thank you.
All right. We are turning now to just, a story that's really taken over the headlines. Really remarkable. Rescue workers from the White Helmets say that they've ended their search operation for possible detainees in secret cells or basements at Syria's notorious Sadnaya military prison after it appears that the facility has now been totally cleared. Now, for many of the prisoners who are being held in this facility for years on end, the rebels have been a godsend. And take a listen to what some of them have to say.
We never thought we would see this moment. We thought we would be executed one by one. Many people were executed in 2019. There were large numbers. Every day, people would be called out to execution. 100, 200, 300 names would be called out. We would hear their names, their father's and their mother's name. One person of the regime told us they were executed. We would hear people moaning.
They are all gangsters working in the prison. They are all gangsters and they will be held accountable. And all the names are here in the documents. Even if they fled to China, we will find them. They must be held accountable, because now we have their names and proof of their crimes. Sadnaya prison officers' names were secret, meaning no one knew what specific officers used to work there. But thank God, we now have their names from these documents, and God willing, they will be held accountable, even before the tyrant Bashar Assad.
I'd like to turn back to our Middle East correspondent Ariel Osran now on this. So how many people have actually been released from these prisons, and what crimes were they accused of?
Of not agreeing with the government, of sometimes voicing their own, expressing their own position against the government. One teenage girl, she opened a blog and just wrote a few things, and she was arrested for that and placed in Sadnaya prison, the human slaughterhouse. Sadnaya is one example, perhaps the most brutal example of how the Assad regime used its political prisons to clamp down on any kind of dissent or simply freedom of expression among its citizens. We're talking about a total of roughly 100,000 in these prisons. Sadnaya alone, roughly 30 to 40,000. Now, this announcement by the White Helmets, the Syrian civil defense, that they have not found any evidence to these underground dungeons. This is a real heartbreak to the families, because you have, since the start of the Syrian civil war, since 2011, you have 96,000 Syrians who are missing.
Right.
And according to the latest assessment by Syrian human rights organizations, they believe that a majority of those 96,000, if not all of them, are no longer alive. And so if you add that to the existing death toll of 500,000 Syrians who have been killed in the civil war since the start of the war in 2011, this obviously increases the number significantly. Now, in the statement of the White Helmets, they urged the families of many of these missing people not to continue the searches independently in the area, as to not to tamper with the evidence. But this is an open wound in Syrian civil society and in attempts to try and rebuild, to get over this trauma. We heard Hazem describe this as the Auschwitz of the Syrians. This is definitely their, from a Syrian perspective, their moment of the camp liberations, of hearing the testimonies of atrocities, people coming out malnourished with mental
even
mental
unable
problems.
to leave because they're too scared to actually leave
or they
the facility.
or they've lost all memory and they don't know who their names are and what their where their families are. You have thousands of these kinds of people who were simply released and no one knows where they who they belong to. And on the flip side, you have tens of thousands of Syrian families who don't know where their loved ones are. This is something that is going to remain with Syria for quite a while as they try to rebuild it. And it has been an open wound. It is just got a little bit more open, and this is something that the international community should give its mind on. So far, we have not really heard any proper statements from organizations like the UN, Amnesty, who were quick to accuse Israel of genocide even before the international courts were able to determine that. We need to see the international community get involved here, not only in the rehabilitation of the Syrians who were liberated, but in trying to reunite tens of thousands of Syrian families.
Yeah, I mean, of course, obviously, we saw rebel leaders who are vowing to prosecute those who are responsible for running these prisons and the vast array of human rights abuses and war crimes carried out there. We're going to have to wait and see how they actually go about doing this and whether or not, like you said, there is that international support to make that happen. But we're going to be turning now to the Gaza Strip. Qatar has decided to rejoin negotiations for a hostage and ceasefire release deal. The Gulf state was reportedly asked by Donald Trump's transition team to re-engage with the mediation after discussions with the Israeli prime minister led to the belief that a deal could be within reach. And this comes as Egypt has also recently held talks with Hamas about the exchange of Palestinian political prisoners and Israeli hostages, including some U.S.-Israeli dual citizens. We're also seeing reports come out not too long ago that there appears to be more interest from Hamas than ever before to actually secure some type of ceasefire deal. So I want to turn back to you, Ariel, on this. I mean, really, what is the latest when it comes to the negotiations? We keep on hearing there's positive movement forward, at least over the course of the last couple of days. Is this perhaps a reaction to what we're seeing happen in Syria and maybe Hamas losing faith in any kind of support?
Look, the mediators are hoping that what happened in Syria could be a further catalyst to trying to restart or bring back the negotiations onto track. This has prompted Qatar to rejoin the fray. I think we should be very careful in terms of the statements, the rhetoric. Let's talk about the facts. The facts are that a plane carrying, executive Israeli jet carrying head of Mossad Ronen Bar and IDF Chief of Staff Herzi Halevi returned from Cairo this evening in an attempt to following discussions between them and Egyptian mediators. We're seeing Qatar rejoining the negotiations, but Egypt really taking point, moving forward here. This visit is definitely important. We've been talking for weeks, reports of an Israeli delegation expected to go. This was the Israeli delegation that we expected to see, we wanted to see go to Egypt to talk about the different steps that need to be done in terms of putting this plan into action. According to statements, this does appear to be having positive momentum, but we need to be very careful because there are still families of 100 hostages who have for over 14 months just waiting for any sliver of information that could not only tell them about the fate of their loved ones, but indicate on a deal. There are positive indications, but as far as what is happening on the ground, an Israeli delegation for the first time in weeks publicly coming back from Cairo following meetings with mediators in Egypt.
Right. The question, of course, though, is why Qatar is rejoining these talks now, whether or not Qatar really is going to be able to make an impact at this point, and also, what incentive Hamas has at this point, if any, to actually seal a deal.
Well, Qatar's main involvement was because they were hosting Hamas. Now, the moment Hamas left, their role was frozen. Now Hamas was called back to Qatar, so Qatar is back in play. That is pretty much the essence of the situation. As long as Hamas is involved in trying to restart the negotiations, even though the United States saying that Hamas was and remains the main obstacle for a deal. The fact that they're back in Qatar is an indication not only that there's potential willingness on their side, but also that the Qataris are choosing to get involved. They have the spokesperson of the Foreign Ministry, Majid Ansari, saying that it's still too soon to say that there are any developments. But at the end of the day, again, the fact that there is this delegation that returned from Cairo is a positive indication, unlike other indications that we've seen in recent weeks and months.
All right. We are moving to a very different story now. Thank you so much for joining us in the studio. I think that's it for you, Ario. We'll be seeing you on the rundown shortly, I'm sure. Since the beginning of the war, initiatives to help Israeli agriculture have multiplied. A group of about 20 Christians from all over the U.S. were in Israel for about 10 days to harvest olives for the benefit of those communities affected by the massacres of October 7th, a journey of solidarity and spirituality. And our correspondent, Deborah Benayoun, from the I-24 News French channel, met that group in Sderot. Take a look.
Who hasn't heard of the many meanings of the olive branch? For Christians, it is above all the symbol of peace and love, a symbol all the more relevant to these 18 American Christians who came from all over the United States to pick olives in southern Israel. A real agricultural pilgrimage, says Jonathan Feldstein, an American Israeli who constantly seeks to build bridges between Christians and Jews.
Is first of all that we know since the war began, there have been tens of millions of dollars worth of agriculture that has been lost and saved by volunteers coming to harvest all over the country. And that's so important. But no one ever did this. No one ever harvested olives. And we know farmers who have lost now 2 years of crops.
A physical activity, but very fun, so much so that we tend to get caught up in the game. A project that also has a strong social dimension because these olives will then be transformed into oil that will be sold to help the populations of southern Israel. And in addition to the harvesting, these 10 days of travel also include meetings with various people, such as the Minister of Agriculture, Avi Dikta, the Deputy Mayor of Sderot, as well as a briefing at the former police station of Sderot, decimated by Hamas terrorists on October 7.
We've done more than harvest olives. We met the grandfather of someone whose twin grandsons are still in captivity in Gaza, and they prayed for him. And that was spontaneous, and he had tears in his eyes, and they had tears in their eyes. And we did a barbecue for soldiers.
The other initiator of this project is Mazer Zadeh, an Iranian-American activist who was imprisoned by the Iranian regime because of her conversion to Christianity.
They executed my best friend, they killed my husband. I experienced a lot, and that's why I feel connected to the pain and sufferings that Jewish people are going through. And through this amazing to Israel, it's not just we sit in our home and just tell Israeli people that we love you. No, we should be here.
And the rainy fall weather won't dampen the enthusiasm of even the youngest participants.
All right. Saudi Arabia is making economic headlines. Apple has announced plans to expand its presence across the kingdom. It looks like the Saudis are going to be hosting the 2034 World Cup after receiving a glowing score from FIFA in the evaluation of the country's bid to do so. And now the British Prime Minister has made his way to Saudi Arabia. And you can see in these images in what appears to be a bid to stimulate UK economic growth. Well, joining us now is economy expert Dr. Alex Coleman to kind of break this down just a little bit more. So first of all, let's talk about the UK here. How crucial of an economic partner is Saudi Arabia to the United Kingdom? What is the government seeking with this visit? Because it's certainly been criticized by many.
Well, I can imagine two major directions. One direction is NEOM. NEOM is the ridiculous megalomaniac real estate project in Saudi. It's totally ridiculous, but I think they've had very good experience with British companies planning, designing, and building such projects, unrelated to the fact that they make no sense whatsoever. So I believe that this can be very lucrative to British companies to design and build such mega projects. There's a lot of money in that, but there's also prestige and recommendation in the future. The other direction, I think, is defense. The UK has been selling a lot of weapons to the Saudis. Have been training their pilots on their simulators. There's a little problem here in the sense that a project that they won in the past also involved bribes, sex bribes, actually. And there was this funny caricature of them. So I think it's very important for the British economy, which has difficulty taking off and competing with the Far East.
Now, turning to Apple, this is really kind of big news across the region. Apple has announced it's launching an online store for Saudi Arabia in 2025 before actually opening its first flagship store in the kingdom in 2026. Now, Saudi Arabia says that this is part of a plan to support the country's digital economy. How big of a win is this for both Saudi Arabia and Apple?
Well, I'm actually surprised that it took Apple so long to open such a megastore, because their megastores are fantastic. They're big, they're luxurious, they're extravagant. And I think Saudi Arabia is exactly the place where you'd expect to see such a store. A big store, flagrant, so people go and buy these products. I would assume that Apple's market share in Saudi Arabia is higher than elsewhere, because people are less sensitive to the prices of the iPhones versus, say, Samsung or other products. So I think that Saudi Arabia, if you look at the segmentation, it's exactly the place where Apple wants to be very much, whether it's in a physical store such as their luxurious stores, or whether it's on the internet. So I believe that the store can be, today we're talking about a hybrid experience where you shop on the internet and decide what you want, then you go to the store and actually buy it. So I think it's an excellent thing for Apple, and it's okay for Saudi Arabia.
Question is, why hasn't Apple made it to Israel yet, right?
Well, Israel, if you compare Israel with Saudi Arabia, it's a very, very different place, because we're much smaller, we're less rich. So I'm not surprised.
What's incentive?
Yes, it's all interest.
All right, I'd like to turn now to FIFA, of course, because this has made major headlines repeatedly. FIFA is also expected to ratify Saudi Arabia's bid to actually host the 2034 World Cup. You know, what can we expect Saudi Arabia to gain from this? What is their hope there? Obviously, when Qatar hosted the World Cup in 2022, it was an effort to kind of boost their international presence and awareness about the country. But we also saw a lot of anger, you could say, about that decision, given the human rights abuses that even took place during the building of the actual stadiums that were used for that event.
Yeah, again, there are two aspects here. One aspect is the fact that FIFA is a corrupt organization. Qatar, we saw the people with the suitcases bribing FIFA executives, which was really flagrant. Yeah. So I don't know about that, but the big thing is that Saudi Arabia wants to show that it's in the prime league, that it's at the top of the world, it can host this thing. The second thing, which I find pathetic, is the desire to make sure that human rights are respected. In Qatar's World Cup in 2022, there were 6,500 migrant deaths. That's what we know. But when I say that's what we know, I assume the number is higher than that. Which means that basically we're talking about a culture that does not respect the life of migrants. They do respect the life of Saudis, but people from India or wherever they come from are not valued. So I'm quite skeptical that if people from FIFA would come and say, ooh, we will be particularly since they get the green light, I do not see them stopping the project somewhere in the middle. I do not see any stick that they can wave to try and respect the lives of these workers. These are incredible numbers, 6,500 people dead. I don't know how many goals were
in Qatar,
scored.
Right, construction, yeah.
So I really am sad in the fact that you see people talking the talk but not walking the walk, and that's really frustrating here.
All right, well, we're going to obviously have to wait and see what happens, but it seems like, we're going to be seeing the World Cup in 2034 take place in Saudi Arabia as of now.
Certainly.
All right, Alex, I'd like to thank you so much for joining us. Very interesting to hear your perspective on all of this. Unfortunately, that is it for now for Middle East Now. We're out for a commercial break, and then we're back with the rundown, so don't go anywhere. I'm Natasha Kirchak, and thanks for joining us.
Shalom and welcome to Jewish World Weekly. I'm Caleb Ben David, and each week we're going to bring you the latest from the Jewish world, from politics to religion, entertainment to the latest trends, and everything in between. Join me each week as we explore the global Jewish diaspora. Don't miss Jewish World Weekly only on I-24 News.
Want to stay on top of the news no matter where you are?
Introducing I-24 News' brand new news website.
On our website, you'll find all the latest articles, interviews, and live broadcasts. Everything you need to know right at your fingertips, whenever you want it.
So what are you waiting for? Download the I-24 News app today.
Intense Israeli military action in Syria by air, sea and land, tackling immediate security threats. Israel reiterating it does not intervene in internal Syrian issues, but it won't allow extremist groups to threaten its citizens. The Biden administration is trying to locate an American freelance journalist abducted in Syria 12 years ago. They have no concrete evidence that Austin Tice is alive, but now that Bashar al-Assad's notorious prisons are being emptied, there is renewed hope he might be found. And it's taken many years and many delays. Benjamin Netanyahu has today taken the stand in his long-running corruption trial in Tel Aviv, calling allegations against him simply ridiculous. This is the rundown on I24 News. I'm Benita Levine. Thank you for joining us. Israel is intensifying its airstrikes in Syria to make sure strategic weapons don't fall into the hands of extremist groups. Israel's Navy missile ships destroying the Syrian military fleet in an overnight operation, all following the recent surprise collapse of the brutal Bashar al-Assad regime. Israel making it clear it will not allow an Islamic terrorist entity to threaten its borders or its citizens. The IDF immediately securing a buffer zone between the Golan Heights and Syria. And in the latest moves, it conducted more than 300 strikes in southern Syria and around Damascus early on Tuesday morning, targeting Syrian army bases, air defense systems and missiles. Reports suggest the Air Force also struck a research center on the outskirts of the capital and an electronic center. Benjamin Netanyahu sharing this video message for rebel groups in Syria just a short while ago. Take a listen.
We have no intention of intervening in Syria's internal affairs, but we definitely do have an interest in doing what is necessary for our security. Consequently, I authorize the Israel Air Force to bomb the strategic military capabilities the Syrian army left behind. This so they would not fall into the hands of the jihadists. This is similar to what the Royal Air Force did when it bombed the ships of Vichy France, which collaborated with the Nazis, so the ships would not fall into Nazi hands. We want relations with the new regime in Syria, but if they will allow Iran to return and base itself in Syria, or allow the transfer of Iranian weapons or any other weapons to Hezbollah or attack us, we will respond forcefully and extract a heavy price. What happened to the previous regime will happen to this one.
Meanwhile, in a letter to the United Nations Security Council, Israeli Ambassador Danny Danon describing the Israeli military actions as limited and temporary measures to address immediate security threats, reiterating that Israel does not intervene in the internal Syrian conflict. The US defending Israel's decision to fill the vacuum after Syrian soldiers fled from posts along the border, but also stressed it must be temporary. And Iran issuing its condemnation, and the UN slamming what it calls the violation of the 1974 Syria disengagement deal.
And then a very troubling development. We are continuing to see Israeli movements and bombardments into Syrian territory. This needs to stop.
Now, the outgoing Syrian Prime Minister has handed over power to the transitional government. Mohammed al-Jalali meeting with rebel leader Abu Mohammed al-Julani a day after that spectacular collapse of Bashar al-Assad's regime. So what has been promised so far? More in this report.
In a lightning-fast onslaught spearheaded by Islamist Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, or HTS as it is known, the government of Syria, which had been fighting a brutal civil war for more than 13 years, fell in a matter of days. The main rebel commander, Ahmed al-Shara, better known as Abu Mohammed al-Golani, has already met with outgoing Prime Minister Mohammed al-Jalali and Vice President Faisal Mekdad to discuss the transitional government. And on Monday, al-Jalali agreed to cede control to the rebel-led Salvation Government, an administration based in northwest Syria, saying the handover could take days to carry out. It was reported that the transitional authority would be headed by Mohammed al-Bashir, who has commanded the Salvation Government. Syria's parliament, formerly pro-Assad like the Prime Minister, said it supports the will of the people to build a new Syria towards a better future governed by law and justice.
We will not dispense of the old practices. It is essential that we take advantage of their existence.
A day after starting negotiations on the handover of power after the overthrow of President Bashar al-Assad, Syria's Islamist rebel commander pledged on Tuesday to go after former high-ranking government officials who were implicated in war crimes and torture. HTS, which has its roots in the Syrian branch of al-Qaeda, has worked to improve its reputation in recent years, despite being banned as a terrorist organization by Western governments.
The United States has clear and enduring interests in Syria. We have a clear interest in ensuring that whatever weapons of mass destruction or components are left in Syria do not fall into the wrong hands. We have a clear interest in doing what we can to avoid the fragmentation of Syria, mass migrations from Syria, and, of course, the export of terrorism and extremism.
Western powers each made similar declarations of readiness for cooperation with Syria's new leadership on the basis of fundamental human rights and the protection of minorities. But there is no model for such a shift in the volatile region, and the opposition has not yet shared its plans for Syria's future.
So the fall of Syrian President Bashar al-Assad has ushered in a new chapter for the war-torn country, but it's also raising fears of a possible resurgence of the Islamic State. The terrorist group, though diminished, thrives in chaos, and Syria's fragile political transition presents a golden opportunity for ISIS to regroup. Our Yulia Papagalova has more in this report.
Bashar al-Assad's ouster by rebel forces has marked the end of a decades-long regime, but has also created a power vacuum that experts warn could benefit the Islamic State, or ISIS. Though its so-called caliphate was crushed in 2019, the group has never fully disappeared. ISIS cells remain scattered across Syria's eastern desert. Their survival is a testament to the instability that has plagued the country for over a decade. The fall of Assad adds a new layer of uncertainty, and ISIS thrives in such conditions. ISIS is one of the most dangerous terrorist organizations in modern history. At its peak, it controlled territory the size of the UK across Iraq and Syria, imposed a brutal regime based on extremist interpretations of Islamic law, and carried out atrocities including mass executions, slavery, and the destruction of cultural heritage sites. Its global network orchestrated or inspired hundreds of attacks worldwide, including in Europe, the US, and the Middle East. Beyond its military capabilities, ISIS has mastered propaganda, using social media to recruit fighters and spread its ideology globally, inspiring lone wolf attackers abroad.
ISIS will try to use this period to reestablish its capabilities, to create safe havens. We have a strong interest in preventing the reemergence of ISIS, given the death and destruction that it's wrought for so long.
Shortly after Assad's regime was declared collapsed, the United States launched a series of airstrikes targeting over 75 ISIS positions in Syria, aiming at preventing the group from re-establishing its foothold. But challenges remain. Overcrowded detention camps, holding thousands of ISIS fighters and their families, are seen as a ticking time bomb. One such camp, Al-Hol, has been a hotspot for radicalization and unrest. Experts warn ISIS may exploit Syria's instability to stage mass prison breaks, as they did in 2022. While rebels now control Damascus, their vision of a civil, democratic Syria stands in stark contrast to ISIS' radical ideology. For the terror group, this is not just an opportunity, but a call to action, with its propaganda positioning it as the only true Islamic authority.
Now, as Bashar al-Assad's notorious prisons are being emptied of political prisoners and dissidents, the Biden administration is working to locate an American freelance journalist abducted in Syria 12 years ago now. They have no concrete evidence that Austin Tice is alive, but the U.S. Special Envoy for Hostages, Roger Carstens, has traveled to Beirut to coordinate efforts to find him. The outgoing president saying they think they can get him back. There have been a number of unverified reports over the years, including several months ago, that Tice might have been held in Iranian-controlled facilities. The FBI has renewed the offer of a $1 million reward for information that leads to his safe recovery. Here's more from the U.S. State Department.
Roger's approach when it comes to returning home Americans who are unjustly detained has always been to really do everything possible to leave no stone unturned, to gather information from wherever he can and press anyone who is willing to take action to get American citizens home. And he is in Beirut to talk with people in the region, to talk with parties in the region, to collect information, and to try to find out where Austin Tice is and get him home as soon as possible. The president has emphasized that as a priority. Secretary Blinken has emphasized it as a priority, and Roger is there to carry out that important work.
Still in Washington, Donald Trump's pick for intelligence chief, Tulsi Gabbard, is facing fresh scrutiny about her proximity to Russian ally Syria following the sudden collapse of the Assad regime. Reuters is reporting she arrived on Capitol Hill on Monday, initially ignoring questions about her 2017 visit to Syria as she ducked into private meetings with senators who are asked to confirm the president-elect's highly unusual nominees. Later, the Democrat turned Republican and a former Army National Reserve Lieutenant Colonel backed Trump's America First approach to foreign affairs. Take a listen.
I want to address the issue that's in the headlines right now. I stand in full support and wholeheartedly agree with the statements that President Trump has made over these last few days with regards to the developments in Syria. My own views and experiences have been shaped by my multiple deployments and seeing firsthand the cost of war and the threat of Islamist terrorism. It's one of the many reasons why I appreciate President Trump's leadership and his election, where he is fully committed, as he has said over and over, to bringing about an end to wars, demonstrating peace through strength, and putting the national security interests and the safety, security, and freedom of the American people first and foremost.
And back in Israel, it's taken many years and many delays. Benjamin Netanyahu has today taken the stand in his long-running corruption trial in Tel Aviv, calling allegations against him simply ridiculous. The Prime Minister is charged with fraud, breach of trust, and bribery. Aljo Brown has the details on the events leading up to this day.
For 8 years, I've been waiting for this day. I've been waiting 8 years for this day to present the truth. For 8 years, I've been waiting to finally blow up the deluded and absurd charges against me. For 8 years, I've been waiting to reveal the method, a method of brutal hunting expedition, because these investigations were born in sin.
A defiant Benjamin Netanyahu addressing the Israeli public on Monday evening, the night before he took to the stand for the first time in his long-running trial. The Israeli Prime Minister is facing charges of bribery, fraud, and breach of trust relating to 3 cases. The first one, known as Case 1000, involves favours related to Hollywood tycoon Arnon Milchan. The case alleges that Milchan and Australian tycoon James Packer gave gifts of cigars, champagne, and jewellery to the Prime Minister and his wife Sarah. In return, Netanyahu allegedly pushed forward tax exemptions that would benefit Milchan, allowing him to influence a merger between Israeli companies Reshet, which Milchan had shares in, and Keshet, which he wanted to invest in, as well as pressuring former US Secretary of State John Kerry to give Milchan a US visa. Case 2000 involves Arnon Moses, the publisher of Yediot Aharonot, Israel's largest paid-for newspaper. This case alleges that Moses offered Netanyahu more favourable coverage and promising a more disparaging coverage of his political opponents in return for legislation that would limit the circulation of Israel Hayom, the pro-Netanyahu free newspaper that rivaled Yediot Aharonot. Unlike Milchan, Moses has also been indicted, facing charges of bribery. The third case, Case 4000, involves Shaul Elovitch, the majority owner of Israeli telecommunications company Bezek. According to the prosecution, Netanyahu urged Elovitch to give more favourable coverage to the Prime Minister through the Walla news site, which was owned by Bezek and Elovitch, in return for easing regulations that promoted the business interests of Bezek, earning the telecommunications giant around $500 million. Elovitch and his wife Iris have also been indicted for charges of corruption and bribery. Netanyahu denies all charges. He says that the gifts he took from Milchan were tokens of friendship, that he opposed a bill that would harm Israel Hayom, and that while his coverage towards him has been unfavourable, he has decried the investigation into him as a witch hunt, and both him and his political allies claim that the trial is politically motivated.
I'm sure of his innocence, and I'm sure that his innocence will be proven.
What is happening is delusional, bringing Netanyahu here in a time of war. This is striking proof that they are trying to overthrow the prime minister, and not through the ballot box.
I came to tell my right-wing friends, it is not enough just to talk. It is not enough to come and make declarations. I expect all the ministers who come here, and also all those who do not come here, to raise the proposal at the upcoming cabinet meeting to consider the dismissal of the Attorney General.
The charges were brought forwards in 2019, with the trial commencing a year later, and witnesses taking to the stand a year after that. The prosecution rested its case in July this year, and Netanyahu's testimony began on Tuesday morning and will continue on Wednesday afternoon. He is expected to give testimony every Monday, Tuesday and Wednesday for the rest of the month.
An update out of Gaza now. The IDF says it's killed 10 Hamas terrorists in an airstrike a day after those terrorists murdered 3 Israeli soldiers in Jabalia. Staff Sergeant Idil Zano, Staff Sergeant Barak Halpern and Sergeant Omri Cohen were killed, and 12 others were wounded when Hamas gunmen opened fire at troops as they launched anti-tank projectiles at a truck used to transport soldiers. The soldiers were getting ready to leave the Strip. Investigations into the incident are still underway. Meanwhile, the IDF has conducted an internal investigation after a Houthi drone hit a residential building in the city of Yavne in central Israel on Monday. The Houthis in Yemen claiming responsibility for that attack. Miraculously, no one was hurt, but warning sirens didn't sound. A probe has found that the drone had not been classified as hostile. It was seen as a civilian vehicle, so it wasn't intercepted. 100 hostages remain in captivity in Gaza, 431 days since the Hamas invasion and mass abduction in southern Israel on the 7th of October. No concrete breakthrough in apparent efforts to secure a ceasefire hostage deal. Earlier today, Noah Argamani, who was rescued in that brazen Israeli operation in Nusayrat in central Gaza back in June after 9 months in terror captivity, sharing this message.
There was an Air Force missile that hit the building that Yossi, Itai Svirsky, and I were in. As you know, Yossi did not survive. 2 days later, Itai Svirsky was murdered, and just this week, his body was returned to Israel. I was left there, battered, left bleeding, with my whole head open, and no one came to help me. We don't know the situation of the 100 hostages still there, and their fate could be even worse than mine.
And now let's take a deeper look at some of those top stories. It's a pleasure to welcome to studio Yaakov Lapin, host of the podcast The Lapin Assessment on Patreon and a military and strategic affairs analyst at the Miriam Institute and the Jewish News Syndicate, and our Middle East correspondent Ariel Oseran. Thank you so much for joining us. All guns blazing, land, air and sea. Yaakov, much on the go inside Syria. Talk to us about what is happening through the eyes of Israeli troops.
Well, look, I think, what's happened in Syria is an earthquake. It's a historical event. It's once in 100 years that something like this is going to happen, that a regime is going to collapse in 11 days after fighting and basically winning a 10-year civil war, only to collapse like a house of cards in 11 days is unprecedented in Israel's neighborhood. And then what Israel has been doing in the past 48 hours is equally unprecedented. We are talking about the elimination of 70 to 80% of Assad's military capabilities, conventional and unconventional, his air force, his missiles, his rockets, his UAVs, ballistic missiles, cruise missiles, things that Russia and Iran have been funneling into Syria for years, are up in flames. So this is history. We are looking at history. Israel saw an opportunity to eliminate a whole range of capabilities because it just doesn't know where they're going to end up. We don't know who all the rebels are. We don't know where this is going. And there are also questions about the intentions of the, Hayat al-Tahrir, the head rebel, and Mohammed al-Julani. Is this a religious war for him, or is this a Syria liberation movement? We don't really have the answer yet. It's going to take time for these things to become apparent. And so Israel, made the decision that in terms of capabilities, it's taking no chances. And we saw a very aggressive wave of airstrikes. I have never seen anything like this in the Middle East. I think, we are living through history, and it's going to take time for us to fully internalize what has happened here. But if we zoom out a little bit more, this is a huge blow to the Iranian Shiite axis. Iran is now cut off from the Mediterranean. It doesn't have this ground corridor that it spent years building to connect it via Iraq to Syria and to Hezbollah in Lebanon. It looks like tens of thousands of Shiite militia members that Iran had injected into Syria have fled, have just vanished. And where have all the regime personnel gone? We don't really know. So there are so many things up in the air right now, but we are definitely living through history.
Historic times indeed. Stay with us. Much more to discuss right now, though. I want to check in with the latest developments on the ground. We go live to correspondent Emmanuel Honora in the Golan Heights. And as you can hear us discussing, Israel making sure that no hostile forces can embed themselves close to the border with Israel, taking action by land, air and sea. What is the latest there, Emmanuel? What can you tell us?
Right, and adding to that, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu coming out with pretty strong words saying that he is ready to have diplomatic relations with Syria only if Syria is not a threat to Israel, as we've obviously been seeing over the course of the last decades. And we've been seeing Israel, we know that Israel has been acting very much preemptively, striking, as you were just discussing in studio, striking massive amounts of targets across Syria, with the IDF releasing a statement earlier today saying that between 70 to 80% of their targets were struck. Syrian military targets were struck, targets that belonged to the Syrian regime, the fallen Assad regime. So really a lot of movement going on there. And this, of course, going on as the IDF has secured its positions in the buffer zone separating Israel and Syria, a move that really has drawn a lot of condemnation from some of the allies and from some of Israel's allies. More recently, earlier this evening, from the UAE issuing a statement similar to Qatar and Turkey, who have said that Israel is violating Syria's sovereignty. So as you can see, there is a lot of moving parts here. It's still too early to tell what exactly will happen in Syria, whether or not there could be, as Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu said, perhaps an opportunity here for diplomatic relations. But at this stage, it's still much too soon to see that, Benita.
As you say, a lot of moving parts at this stage. Correspondent Emmanuel Honora, live from the Golan Heights. Thank you so much. And still in studio, Middle East correspondent Ariel Osaran. A lot of moving parts indeed, and some of those moving parts are heading close to Aleppo. Bring us up to speed on the latest developments on the ground.
Yeah, with widespread global condemnation and outrage over Israel seizing defensive positions in southwest Syria. We're seeing in the northern countryside of Aleppo, on the border between Syria and Turkey, Turkish forces, convoys of armored vehicles entering through the border town of Jarablus into northern Syria. It's actually closer to Manbij, the town, the Kurdish town, that was controlled by Kurds that Turkish-backed forces recently seized control. In general, we're seeing pretty violent offensive advance of these Turkish-backed forces in northern Syria, trying to repel, push away Kurdish elements from those areas. It is believed that an attempt to push away Kurdish forces from northern Syria, the border with Turkey, was one of the objectives of Turkey in supporting this advancement of this rampage of Syrian rebel forces to take Damascus. So this was really what they were intending to do. So It will be interesting to see if there will be any global comments regarding Turkey's now military involvement in Syria. This is a development from the past hour, and it will be interesting to see what these forces do, where they head. I'm not so sure that their intentions, if we're looking at what their supported forces are doing to Kurdish elements, if their intentions are indeed defensive.
Your assessment, Yakov, on exactly that progress, so to speak, from those Turkish forces?
Yeah, I think we have to watch Turkey very carefully because it seems to have several plans for Syria, and none of them seem to be very positive for regional stability. One is this offensive against the Kurdish forces, the Syrian Democratic Forces, the SDF, which is a U.S. ally, which has been instrumental in fighting ISIS and Islamic jihadist forces in Syria. And I think, the West really owes it to the Kurds to provide them with some support right now in their hour of need. We also, saw the Israeli Foreign Minister, Gideon Sa'ar, condemn this attack on the Kurds. And, from an Israeli perspective, the Turks have a number of groups in the rebel coalition, specifically in the Syrian National Army, that they are really supporting with equipment, with logistics, with trucks. And we have to watch those groups because Erdogan has threatened Israel in the past, and he may try to move some of those groups to our border. That is something that we will have to watch.
A rapidly developing situation indeed. Gentlemen, stay with us. More to discuss right now, though. We're taking a very quick break. When we get back, our coverage continues on The Rundown. Benjamin Netanyahu in court in Tel Aviv today. We bring you the latest. Stay tuned. Don't go anywhere.
You live in Israel or you are preparing for your Aliyah? Congratulations. You have a smartphone? Perfect. Download the Olim app for free and discover everything we have to offer. Booking medical and administrative appointments, bills paying, debt verification, instant translation, contractor recommendation, request tracking, and much more. And if you can't manage it on your own, our team speaks your language and assists you with all your procedures in Israel, starting from 199 shekels per month, unlimited and for the whole family. Don't hesitate any longer. Download the app or contact us.
This broadcast is brought to you by Israel Bonds, the most direct and impactful way to support Israel. Invest now at israelbonds.com. This broadcast is brought to you by Israel Bonds, the most direct and impactful way to support Israel. Invest now at israelbonds.com.
Welcome back to The Rundown. Benjamin Netanyahu has today taken the stand in his long-running corruption trial in Tel Aviv, calling allegations against him simply ridiculous. He is the first sitting prime minister to testify in his own public corruption trial in a drama that is expected to dominate headlines here at home at a time when there is much to focus on around the region. So for more, let's go to Ariel Kahana, diplomatic correspondent at Yisrael Hayom. He joins us from Geva Ben Yamim. Ariel, good to see you. So Benjamin Netanyahu in court today. There have been many delays, efforts to push this out. He seemed confident, he sounded confident, and had many supporters inside the courtroom. What stood out for you on day one?
Hello, Benita. It's good to be with you again. So, to be very frank, I'm going to ruin the party because of course it was a dramatic day, because as you said, it's the first time we have sitting prime minister in a trial, giving his witness as a witness, talking about trying to defend himself as well, of course. But there was no big news, I would say. I mean, at least to me, it's not that he said anything we didn't know. I mean, at least those people who follow Netanyahu and know him, I don't think there was anything new about that. Now, I'm not talking about from legal point of view, because I'm not an expert for that. I'm talking for, as a citizen or as a reporter. He didn't say there anything that we didn't know from before. And he gave broadly his narrative about the media, in his view, the leftist media, and how he sees the media covering him in a very negative way. And I must say, I don't think he's wrong about that. But the question is not is the media in Israel is left or right, but whether he did a crime the way he handled the media. I can tell you what my opinion is, but it's, of course, it's for the judges to decide, and we don't know how would they judge in the end of the day. What they just today we're beginning to hear, and it's going to go for a long period, at least in the coming weeks, and probably even more.
And of course, he's saying that these allegations are ridiculous, and he was astonished to be indicted on charges of trying to control the media. A long way off, but how do you see this all unfolding for him?
So he gave his story, and by the way, again, maybe he's not wrong, but saying that most of the media is leaning to one side. Israel is not the only country that it happens, and I think a lot of Israelis can feel can agree with him that mainstream media is not sharing Netanyahu's views and is not supportive of the Likud. That's well known. And that was his main point today. So he was going, to tell some stories from history about Obama and about Netanyahu himself, how he was covered negatively even in the 90s, which again, he's definitely correct about that. But would all of that impress the judges? I don't know. I can tell you, they were very silent today. There were no comments by the judges today. It's the first day, and I tell you even more, Benita, it's the first day. So for us as journalists, from media point of view, it's a dramatic days. It was a dramatic day. But the question, what would happen in the coming days and weeks and months? Because the legal decision will be according to some small details that were not discussed today at all in the court. Right. So again, for us, for the public, for us, it was a dramatic, even historic day, maybe from negative point of view. But what would be the impact on the final decision? It's a very long way to go.
A long way indeed. But Ariel, it's not the best optics to have a sitting prime minister facing these corruption charges during a war that has continued for more than 14 months now, not to mention, of course, these latest developments in Syria. I mean, a short while ago, he was issuing a video message to Syrian rebels, and a few hours before, he's sitting in court. How worrying is this that Benjamin Netanyahu's time is going to be divided somewhat over the next few weeks, maybe months?
So when it comes to running the government and running the country, I think it's going to be okay in one way or another. Because first of all, even today, he got some secret notes during his testimony from his aides. So when it is really needed for security reasons to stop the testimony and deal with what he has to deal, it's going to happen. And I'll tell you even more. I think the judges at some point will say, okay, 3 days for a sitting prime minister during a war, as you said, is too much. And even today, they cut the discussions, I think, about half hour before what was planned. So I guess we will probably see less time he's putting into that. But I think the common wisdom in Israel today, from all sides, whether you're a Bibi lover or a Bibi hater, it feels that there should be a deal. Because once the bribery part of the allegation was taken down by the judges a few months ago, I will remind you. So now it's not, the significant allegations are, again, it's serious, but it's not as big as it used to be.
Right.
And considering all the circumstances and the war and the public support he gets and so on, a lot of experts are saying today that there should be a deal between him and the prosecution. I don't know how it's going to end, because both sides, I understand, refuse at the moment. But if there will be a kind of a deal of agreement between him and the prosecutor, I think a lot of people will be happy with that.
Well, certainly many questions remain around another potential deal, and that, of course, is a deal for the release of all the hostages and a ceasefire deal. So, as you say, much to focus on for the Prime Minister right now. Ariel Kahane, diplomatic correspondent at Israel Hayom, thank you very much for being with us on I-24
Thank you, Benita.
News. Yaakov Lapin, we're hearing about divided concerns and focus for the Prime Minister. Earlier on in the broadcast, we spoke about the video message that Benjamin Netanyahu released just a short while ago to rebels, to this transition government in Syria, saying ultimately Israel wants peace, but if you don't behave, I'm paraphrasing, Israel's watching, Israel will act.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, Israel's messaging here is very clear. It's telling the rebels that they have the option of making a decision in their own self-interest, which is to pursue a peaceful policy towards Israel, to not allow radical fundamentalists to approach the Israeli border with Syria on the Golan Heights, and basically to keep their house in order when it comes to southern Syria. We've also heard calls to make sure that Iran will not be able to renew its supply lines via Syria to Hezbollah. Now, I think that actually, in this case, the Sunni rebels don't need to be told that, because they have every interest in preventing Iran, which is their enemy, and we saw how they treated the Iranian embassy in Damascus, from entrenching itself again. The rebels have no interest in allowing that to happen. So I think we're seeing, very initial messaging by Israel to the rebels, saying, if you essentially treat us as a peaceful neighbor, we, Israel, will reciprocate. And if you treat us with hostility, if you allow radical fundamentalists to approach our border, then military action will be taken, just as it has been taken against the radical Shiites who were trying to set up base on the Golan Heights, on the Syrian Golan Heights. So now we're going to have to see how those messages filter down and how they affect the behavior of the rebels. There are so many rebel groups that I don't think we can even talk about a single rebel entity at this stage. We'll have to see how this plays out.
Certainly complicating the situation as we speak. Gentlemen, stay with us, because right now we turn our attention to the United States and we go live to our senior U.S. correspondent, Mike Wagenheim. He joins us from the U.S. Capitol. Good to see you, Mike. So let's start with Donald Trump's pick for intelligence chief. Tulsi Gabbard is facing fresh scrutiny for her role and her links to Syria, of course, a close ally of Russia. How is this all being received in the halls of Washington? What can you tell us?
Bad timing for Gabbard, who was already one of Trump's more controversial cabinet picks. Tulsi Gabbard, the former Democratic member of the House of Representatives, who has over the years parroted what many believe to be Russian propaganda. She also met with Bashar al-Assad in Syria back in 2017, which many members of Congress say, fine, we need to meet with our enemies as well. However, she went on it multiple times throughout the years to shower praise on Assad and his leadership leadership of Syria. That really has some members of the Senate here in the Capitol concerned. It's the Senate who will approve or disapprove of her nomination for the role of intelligence chief, which is obviously an incredibly sensitive position to begin with. Gabbard met with members of the Senate here in the Capitol yesterday. I'm not sure if anybody really gave rousing approval of her nomination, but it was more of a sense of where exactly she stands at the particular moment, clarity on her particular positions, including on Russia, Ukraine, and on Syria, now that it's back in the news once more. And some senators say we're more here than anything to kind of guide her through the process, make sure she gets a fair shot during her nomination hearings, which, of course, she'll be taking questions not only from Republicans, but also unfriendly fire from Democrats with regards to her positions, especially when it comes to foreign policy. So I'm not sure if Gabbard, based on the initial reactions of senators yesterday, hit anything out of the park, per se, but I don't think she lost any votes either. I think this is going to be a wait-and-see process for her, and those nomination hearings coming up in about a month or so will be key to her advancement. I doubt very many Republicans are going to vote against, but it only takes 3 or 4 really to turn the tide and to kill her nomination, just because that's how close it is right now in the Senate come January.
Fascinating times in Washington. Indeed, also an interesting appointment of a pro-Israel congressman to head the House Foreign Affairs Committee. Brian Mast has volunteered with the IDF and spoken out in support of Israel. How's that going down?
Mast is a fascinating case in and of himself. He was elected to Congress in 2016. He formerly served in the U.S. Army, had his legs blown off while trying to clear a road for U.S. Army Rangers in Afghanistan. He was an explosive ordnance technician. He walks with prosthetic legs and volunteered for the IDF now many years ago. Volunteered with a nonprofit distributing kits to the IDF and moving supplies and such. But Mast has been pro-Israel to the hilt. He's also made some controversial comments with regards to Palestinian citizens in Gaza, saying they're essentially equating them to German citizens during the Nazi era. So that's brought a little heat on him. But in terms of his pro-Israel bona fides, well, I don't think those can be questioned whatsoever. He will take to the gavel of the House Foreign Affairs Committee coming up in January, and should be another pro-Israel voice in a very important role coming up. The House Foreign Affairs Committee often deals with appropriations issues. It often deals, obviously, with policy issues, and therefore having somebody like Mast can only be of benefit to Israel and its allies coming up in the next Congress.
Live from the U.S. Capitol, senior U.S. correspondent Mike Wagenheim. Appreciate the update. Thank you so much. And still in studio, Yaakov Lapin and our Middle East correspondent, Ariel Osaran. And we spoke earlier on in the show, Ariel, about Austin Tice, a freelance American journalist believed to have, well, disappeared in Syria some 12 years ago. It's not quite sure whether he's alive or not. He may have been in one of those notorious prisons, but now the U.S. stepping up efforts to find out more if he's alive, and if so, to get him home. Tell us more.
Well, these efforts are coinciding with efforts of tens of thousands of Syrians who are trying to reconnect with their loved ones, because since the start of the Syrian civil war, there are believed to be 96,000 Syrians who are missing. And just yesterday, the head of one of the Syrian human rights organizations went on opposition TV, and he pretty much burst out crying, describing that their current assessment is that those 96,000 are probably dead, and that would increase the death toll of the Syrian civil war from 500,000 to closer to 600,000. Obviously, the United States focused on its own citizens, but this is a much larger issue that is going to be, it's an open wound in Syrian society, and this is going to continue to be as such moving forward. Many Syrians describing the images that we saw, for instance, from Sednaya prison, the human slaughterhouse, the most notorious of political imprisonment sites, where 30 to 40,000 political prisoners, which is a title that does not properly describe who these people are, because many are women, many are children who were born inside the walls of the prison. They're describing this as their concentration camp liberation moment for the Syrians. And it kind of echoes memory from those times after World War II, after the Holocaust, with testimonies of abuse, torture, malnourishment, thousands of people being freed, liberated, and in a horrific mental status. And many of these people don't know where their families are, and their family members don't know where they are. And there isn't a proper government in place to help reconnect them, not to say, let alone bringing those responsible to justice. With the Syrian Civil Defense announcing yesterday that they have stopped their searches for these underground dungeons that many of these families believe that were used to imprison their loved ones. This is something moving forward that already Syrians are begging the international community to get more involved in this, not only regarding their own citizens, but to try and make a first positive step in the rebuilding of and rehabilitation of Syria, a process that is going to be going on for many, many years, with this issue of the political prisons of tens of thousands of families who are disconnected, many trying to reconnect unsuccessfully as of now. This is something that Syrians are going to be dealing with for a while, and they are already urging the international community to get involved. We have not really heard any significant statements regarding the general situation of the political prisoners. Obviously, each country trying to take care of its own citizens, but this is a much larger issue that will require much more significant coordination and cooperation on the part of the international community.
Brutal scenes indeed. We wait to see how human rights organizations as well around the globe will respond. Stay with us, because right now we go to the Vatican. Pope Francis will meet Palestinian Authority President Mahmoud Abbas on Thursday, as the Catholic pontiff becomes more vocal in his criticism of Israel's retaliatory military operation in Gaza following the October 7th Hamas invasion and mass abduction. Abbas travels to Italy this week, where he is set to meet with President Sergio Mattarella and Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni. Now, on the weekend, the Pope unveiled a Palestinian nativity scene gifted to the Vatican, featuring a representation of baby Jesus in a kfir, the traditional Palestinian national scarf draped on Jesus's cradle. The pontiff called on believers to remember the brothers and sisters who in Bethlehem and other parts of the world are suffering from the tragedy of war. So for more, we go live to Rome and we welcome Vatican journalist Francis Rocca from the Italian capital. Thank you so much for your time. The Vatican announcing today the pontiff will be meeting with Palestinian Authority President Mahmoud Abbas. Not giving any details, though. What do you make of this? What is likely to come out of a discussion like this, given the Pope's comments up until now on the war?
Well, the Pope and the Vatican try to be even-handed about this, which of course doesn't make everyone happy, or perhaps makes everyone unhappy. It should be noted that on Saturday he went and saw that Palestinian nativity scene you mentioned. On Sunday, he went to go see Chagall's White Crucifixion, with a painting from the 1930s that shows scenes of pogroms in Russia, anti-Semitic violence in Kristallnacht, and so that identifies the crucifixion of Christ with the persecution of Jews. So they're trying they're always trying to balance and counterbalance. From the beginning of the war in Gaza, they've said no to terrorism, but no to arms. So equating, and this has made Israeli government very unhappy. And he even called, as you know, the operation in Gaza terrorism. But I think, the Vatican has always been sympathetic to the Palestinian cause. Some Palestinians are Christians, of course. Even John Paul, who had begun a great effort to have better rapport with Jews, going to synagogues, which has become obligatory for every pope since. But there's always been that effort, and so that I think, and this Pope Francis, early in his pontificate, held that prayer for peace with Shimon Peres and Abbas in the Vatican Gardens in 2014. So I think there's always the effort to sort of be neutral and push for peace. And of course, that doesn't make everybody happy, obviously.
Certainly doesn't make everybody happy. The Pope, of course, has met with some families of the hostages. But right now, as you well know, 100 hostages are still in captivity in Gaza for more than 14 months now. So a strong voice out of the Vatican, a voice of reason, ethics, morality, condemning the fact that the hostages, who range in age from a baby to elderly peace activists, might be appropriate right now as well. Could the pontiff have been more outspoken, more outraged about this current situation for the Israeli hostages more than 14 months in?
Well, he always pairs it. His usual formula is stop the war, release the hostages, or release the hostages, stop the war. He always pairs the two. So I'm sure he'll do that again. And you know, again, it's a similar situation in Ukraine where he says stop the war, but he won't blame Russia. So I mean, it's another case, of course, but he's always trying to bring two things together, and the idea is simply to bring peace. But yes, as you're right, he did meet with the hostages' families at the same time. The same morning, the first time at least, he met with some people from Gaza. So he's always. I think he will do that again. He will call for the hostages to be released, certainly.
And very briefly, much reaction, of course, to the Pope unveiling that Palestinian nativity scene, so to speak, gifted to the Vatican. Tell us very briefly some of the varied reactions so far.
Well, I mean, the concern is that there is a long-standing practice in some quarters of trying to play down Jesus's Judaism, which is, of course, not historically correct and is not the teaching of the Catholic Church. So there was some concern that was having that effect. That it was saying, oh, he was a Palestinian, but I would say that there's no question that the Pope recognizes that Jesus was a Jew. He has been criticized never for anti-Semitism, because he has had very good relations with Jews in Buenos Aires and always, but of anti-Judaism, a theological, sometimes when his criticism of Jewish theology, but that's another subject.
Right.
But I think that's right, yeah.
Well, we certainly appreciate your insight into all these developments. Live from Rome, Vatican journalist Francis Rocca, thank you very much for your time.
Thank you.
And still in studio, interesting times indeed. Yaakov Lapin, host of the podcast, The Lapin Assessment on Patreon. Yaakov, earlier on in the show, we spoke about the Iranian axis of resistance. For all intents and purposes, it is being obliterated stage by stage. Right now, though, Israel has troops in Lebanon, also in Syria, also in Gaza. How do you see this all playing out? What does it all mean for Iran? The supreme leader speaks tomorrow publicly.
Iran is in a huge crisis because its whole strategy was to take over the Middle East, become the hegemonic force, surround Israel with a ring of fire, and lead to Israel's collapse. And it thought that things were going its way a year ago, and now when it looks around the region, it has lost Hamas as a regional proxy. Hezbollah is a shadow of its former self. Israel doesn't have to think about Hezbollah if it's considering a strike on Iran's nuclear program. It has lost Assad, the Assad regime, which was a central pillar in the Middle East. This was a huge Arab ally of the Islamic Revolution, gone. And so I think that they're going to be very concerned about what's coming next. There's essentially nothing to really deter Israel from looking at strike options regarding the nuclear program. And by the way, that is where Iran seems to be focusing now its efforts. The nuclear program is making serious and alarming advancements. They're able to enrich very, just unacceptable levels of uranium to almost weapons grade, and they're very, very far advanced. So it seems that the worse that things go regionally for Iran, the more it doubles down on its nuclear program. But in terms of its regional strategy, this strategy, I wouldn't say it's completely collapsed because they still have the Houthis in Yemen, they've got Shiite militias in Iraq, and they're going to try to rebuild Hezbollah, and they'll try to rebuild Hamas. I'm sure that as long as this regime stands, they'll try to do that. But the regional strategy is in the worst shape that it has been in decades, and this is definitely a fateful moment that's very much in Israel's benefit and to the detriment of the Iranian regional strategy.
Ariel Issaran.
Yeah, I just want to add that moving forward, it is going to be interesting to see how HTS conducts itself in relations to Iran, because we saw with Damascus taken over by the rebels, they started partially destroying at least the facade of the Iranian embassy there, but then by orders of Abu Hamad al-Julani, Ahmad al-Shari, the leader of Hayat Tahrir Hashem HTS, they took a step back and he ensured them that not only will the Shiite minority be protected, but that Iranian sites will be protected. And so moving forward, it is going to be very important to see what kind of game HTS plays vis-a-vis the Iranians. Also the Russians, they've promised to protect their military assets or to prevent them from being harmed at this point in time. So a lot of moving pieces, but I totally agree with Yaakov's analysis that this is one of the lowest points for the Iranian axis in the region in years.
30 seconds left. Yaakov, how does Donald Trump coming into the Oval Office in January impact whether or not Israel strikes Iran first?
Well, I think that the biggest question on the minds of Israeli decision makers will be: will Trump give Israel a green light? Will he give assistance, diplomatic, military? Will he take part, himself in a strike like that? Will he enable Israel with munitions to do a strike like this? These are big questions. There's a timeline that's not necessarily up to us because the Iranians are racing ahead on that nuclear program. But I think those are the top questions.
Top questions. Always appreciate your insights and your answers. Thank you so much. Yaakov Lapin, Ariel Oseran, appreciate you being part of The Rundown. And that is a wrap for this edition of The Rundown. I'm Benita Levine, live in Tel Aviv. Thank you for watching. Stay tuned.
Shalom. ¿Qué me trae por aquí? La necesidad impostergable de 600 millones de hispanoparlantes que ahora necesitan escuchar el mensaje judío e israelí en tiempos difíciles. ¿Cómo lograrlo? Cuento con ustedes para continuar llevando a lo más alto del mundo mediático una inquebrantable diplomacia pública al servicio de la verdad sin concesión alguna.
Welcome to the I-24 News National Security Podcast in partnership with INSS, the Institute for National Security Studies. I'm your host, Nicole Zedek. Each week, we're bringing you in-depth discussions with expert analysts on some of the most pressing national security challenges facing Israel today. So, let's get started. Today, we're tackling the rapidly evolving Indo-Pacific region. Now, this is an area with some of the world's fastest growing economies, critical maritime routes, and very complex security dynamics. This region has become the focal point of global competition, with major powers like the United States and China both vying for influence. And for Israel, this region presents both opportunities and challenges. We're going to unpack just what those are and the role Israel can play in the dynamic Indo-Pacific region, which could be critical to Israel's strategic future. What bold steps should tiny Israel take to establish itself as a key player in one of the most contested arenas on the global stage? Well, to answer this big question and many more, I'd like to introduce Dr. Ori Sella, a senior visiting researcher at the Diane and Guilford Glaser Israel-China Policy Center at the INSS, and a senior lecturer at the Department of East Asian Studies at Tel Aviv University. Dr. Sella, thanks for being with us on the podcast today.
Thank you for having me.
Now, as we're getting started, I want to paint a picture on a map for our listeners. When we're talking about the Indo-Pacific region, describe the area as we're talking about. I think a lot of our listeners might be familiar with the term, but what countries and are we actually talking about here?
Well, it's important to remember that there is no distinct, clear definition of where the Indo-Pacific begins and ends. But in general, we're talking about the two oceans, the Pacific Ocean, the Indian Ocean, on two sides, one on the west, one on the east. And their connectivity is a major part of the evolution of this idea. So the Indo-Pacific in general begins, one could say, in the western shores of America and ends all the way in the eastern shores of Africa, and everything in between is part of it.
This is a massive region we're talking about then. So what geopolitical forces are really dominant in the region?
Well, the thing is that this concept, the Indo-Pacific, is less geographical and more an organizing concept, a geopolitical organizing concept to this vast region. So within this region, we have all kinds of players, both players that one would perhaps hesitate to call Indo-Pacific players, but that see themselves as Indo-Pacific players. So the most dominant one is, of course, the United States. And the United States declared very straightforwardly that it is an Indo-Pacific country. And of course, we have China on the other hand in Asia as another very dominant player. And in between, we have other countries, some of them trying to get more and more important in global affairs, such as India, such as Japan, and of course others, South Korea, and of course Australia, and many, many other countries of Southeast Asia, and so on and so forth.
And when it comes to these regions, you just named a lot of different countries, not all of them with friendly ties. Speaking of the United States and China. And so where does Israel come into this with their relationship with the Indo-Pacific region?
Well, I think before we get into where Israel stands vis-a-vis this Indo-Pacific region or concept, it's important to understand where the concept comes from, because that's how Israel can connect to it. And if we take a kind of historical outlook, one of the fascinating things about this concept is that it didn't emerge just in the last 2 decades. It started out as a geopolitical concept over a century ago. And It did not start out neither in the United States or in Asia. It started out in Germany. And Germany, between the two great wars, between World War I and World War II, Germany at that time felt constrained, felt pressured, felt that what it called its enemies, meaning the Western powers, were limiting anything that it could do, especially in the maritime arena. And that's when thinkers in Germany began proposing that Germany should team up with Indo-Pacific players. That's the origins of this political term, in order to fight those other powers. Meaning the origins of the term are actually in order to combat the Western powers that today embrace this very same idea. But since that idea was tightly connected to Nazi Germany very soon thereafter, when World War II ended in 1945, very quickly that idea just disappeared and became unpopular, unfashionable, and whatnot. Only in the 2000s, that's when the idea gained another currency. And that time, the person that's most associated with the new rise of the Indo-Pacific is Shinzo Abe, who is no longer with us, the Prime Minister of Japan at the time. And he tried to bolster this idea again, this time not in order to contain the Western powers, but to contain China. China's growing dominance during the 2000s, that was something that Shinzo Abe and his fellow, let's say, leaders of other countries, they thought that that was the time to bring this idea again and to try to see how to contain China using that notion.
So to more, it sounds like, unite some of the Western countries against China, it could be.
Well, here's when the term Western countries begin to lose track, or to lose traction, because at the time when we're talking about the 2000s and specifically around 2006, 2007, when Shinzo Abe proposes the idea, well, first of all, he's an Asian actor, but he teams up first and foremost with the Indian government. So we have two very major Asian powers underlying this new notion of Indo-Pacific, one from the Pacific, Japan, one from the Indian Ocean, India, obviously. And they brought together with the United States and Australia in order to begin forming a kind of a dialogue, a joint dialogue partnership that's called the Quad, the Quadrilateral Dialogue. So the Quad, the four that I just mentioned, they started out around that time. But they had all kinds of internal issues. Shinzo Abe was no longer prime minister. He had to wait a few years to come back, to make a comeback. And the same held for India. In Australia, a much more pro-Chinese government was getting its own place. So the idea basically was scrapped for a while. But very soon after that, when we get to the 2010s, that's when we have Shinzo Abe again as prime minister, bringing out his new ideas on how to make this Indo-Pacific into a viable notion that you could work with. And that's when the notion of FOIP, Free and Open Indo-Pacific, began. So the idea was we need to create this space as a free and open area, region, partnership, where we can do our economical exchanges, our security exchanges, everything under this notion of FOIP in the Indo-Pacific. At the same time, he was talking about that in 2012. At the same time, we also had the pivot to Asia
from the United States and the Obama administration.
Exactly. And a year later, China began pursuing what came to be known as the Belt and Road Initiative. So we have Japan, India, Australia, and of course the US trying to pivot into Asia and change the landscape and contain China in a way. And we have China trying to break free out of this so-called containment. It took another few years, and under the Trump administration in 2017, we had a renewed Quad. Again, Japan, US, India, this time under Modi, Prime Minister Modi, and Australia, trying to rebuild this dialogue. And as we come, by the way, that's also the time when in 2018, the US Pacific Command was renamed the Indo-Pacific Command. So you see how...
See all of these changes.
Exactly. And when we get to the Biden administration, that's when the region becomes, and the concept becomes very, very potent. And I would say, I mean, that if we're trying to think of it more theoretically, and if you think about what happened after the Second World War with the notion of the Truman Doctrine and the hub and spokes idea that the United States has bilateral arrangements with different countries in East Asia, what we see, especially during the Biden administration, is a turn to what I term the hub and minilaterals format, meaning instead of just having the U.S. connect bilaterally with another country and try to pursue it to go in whatever way, what we have now is minilateral, small alliances of 3-4 countries, sometimes a bit more, sometimes a bit less, that the U.S. is kind of pivoting into and making it all work together. And one of them is, of course, the Quad that I just mentioned, that started earlier. Then we have other alliances, such as the alliance between the United Kingdom, Australia, and the United States, AUKUS, which is much more security-oriented, and many other mini alliances, and also one bigger one.
And so what's the one bigger one?
The one bigger one is under construction, so to speak. That is the IPEF, the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework. The idea is to create a very large partnership of countries throughout the Indo-Pacific, starting with the US and ending all the way with India. And this larger economic framework is supposed to counter all kinds of other economic frameworks that China has been fostering since 2016, when Trump came to power, and very quickly he left one of Obama's top priorities, the TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which was supposed to be a kind of this kind of an economic partnership that leaves China out. Once Trump let go of that and said that the United States is not part of it, China took advantage of that and began creating its own economic partnership in the region. And under Biden, the IPEF is a sort of a revival of this TPP, again leaving China out and creating a wider alliance of like-minded countries. Not all of them are like-minded, but
certainly not all of them are like-minded. Now, Dr. Selle, you're talking a lot about the different economic opportunities and partnerships we see between many of these countries, but what about the different strategic and security partnerships that we can see, especially how Israel could play into those, because Israel is one of the leading defense tech hubs in the world. How could they play in and kind of benefit from some of these partnerships?
So one of the interesting things about Israel vis-a-vis the Indo-Pacific is that often people don't really talk about that because it seems that Israel is out of the way. It's not there. Now, you could say the same about Europe. Europe is even further apart, but Europe has an Indo-Pacific strategy. Recently, we had a British Indo-Pacific policy. Even Scandinavian countries have their own Indo-Pacific strategies, and NATO has its own Indo-Pacific strategy. So, and NATO is obviously not exactly Pacific, it's Atlantic. So what I'm trying to say is that many of the countries beyond Israel have already understood the significance of the Indo-Pacific. But Israel has a unique advantage in, I would say, two ways. One is that Israel's location is highly strategic. And, you know, we learn about it in first grade already, about Israel's location between Asia, Africa, and Europe. Well, it's true. we study about it in school, and it's still true. And Israel's location is critical because when you look at the Indo-Pacific and you look at the interest from the European countries in the Indo-Pacific, the link that kind of connects the Indo-Pacific with Europe and even before that with the Mediterranean is Israel. Not just Israel, but Israel is a key player.
Is this similar to what Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, as far as economic opportunities, first proposed a little bit of a year and a half ago about this massive trade route that's going to start in India, go through the Middle East, go through Israel, and up through Europe as well, connecting all of these regions?
The initiative that you're talking about, we call it the IMEC, India, Middle East, Europe Economic Corridor, IMEC. So this proposal, Biden first suggested that in March of 2023, so it's like
nearly two years ago.
Yeah, it looks like forever. And then in September 2023, just a couple of weeks before October 7th, Biden proposed it in a very large way in India, in a big meeting in India. And of course, Prime Minister Netanyahu is in favor of it. I can't think of anyone who would be not in favor of this initiative. One could claim that thinking about this initiative and what it meant to the countries not included in this corridor, Iran, that could spark some discontent there. But definitely the IMEC is one of those ways in which Israel can connect materially, geographically, in every possible way to this Indo-Pacific. But it's not just the economic corridor. If you think 2 years earlier, after the Abraham Accords, what was established is a kind of minilateral of the sort I was talking about, which is the I2U2. I2 meaning Israel, India, two I's, and two U's are UAE and United States. Now, this minilateral also connects to the Indo-Pacific in very significant ways. India is part of it, and to the Middle East. By the way, the Middle East is, as I said earlier, the boundaries of the Indo-Pacific are very fuzzy. But if, for example, you talk, as we do often, with, for example, Japanese scholars or practitioners who work on the Indo-Pacific, one of the things they'll immediately tell you is that they see the Middle East as a part of the eastern edges of the Indo-Pacific. So having the I2U2 was another way to use a minilateral within the larger Indo-Pacific framework in order for Israel to gain both economic advantages, but certainly also technological and security issues, because the UAE and India have important security ties to Israel. If you add to that the fact that over the past decade, the relationship between Israel and arguably two of the most important players within the Indo-Pacific, putting aside for a second the US, namely Japan and India. The relationship between Israel and Japan and Israel and India have grown gradually but very significantly better over the past decade. So having this kind of a relationship with India, security issues is certainly part of the it's certainly on the table and a significant part of what Israel does with India, but gradually also with Japan, especially since Japan over the past few years began to realize, and some of it has to do with Indo-Pacific issues, and of course with the China looming overhead, Japan began to realize that it needed to change its own strategy, not just about the Indo-Pacific, but also regarding its own defense strategy. And then Japan, over the past 2 years, less so during the war.
Well, I'm curious how the war has impacted those growing relationships you said over the past several years, but what about over the past year, those budding relationships? How have they been impacted between Israel and some of these Indo-Pacific regions?
One of the, I would say, one of the problems that the war quite naturally created for Israel ties with India and even more so with Japan is that some of these ties had to go kind of under the radar, and some of these ties had to be limited. We've seen all kinds of influence campaigns trying to get companies, high-tech companies in Japan, for example, to cut their ties with Israeli high-tech companies, especially ones that deal with security. Still, the potential is there, and the understanding in Japan that there's a lot that they can benefit from such an, let's call it an alliance with Israel. Potentially one could also think of a Japan, India, Israel alliance in these subjects. Japan understands very well. And actually, in that sense, the war has demonstrated, unfortunately for us, but it demonstrated the capabilities of Israel in terms of defense, exactly. So all these kind of demonstrated weapon systems, and especially in the defense area, are things that Japan, India, as many other countries we know of, various deals made with European counterparts about the Arrow system and so on and so forth. So there are plenty of things in which Japan and India can benefit from increasing their ties with Israel, but due to the war, they had to tone it down, put it under the radar, and wait a little bit.
So what happens next then for Israel when it comes to these relationships with the Indo-Pacific countries? Because you talked about these budding relationships. How can Israel best move forward? Is there even a strategy that Israel is thinking of right now, or is this really put on the back burner compared to the other problems Israel faces?
To the best of my understanding, there is no Israeli Indo-Pacific strategy, and it's not surprising. Israel doesn't have strategies on many things, so that's one of them. But I do think that Israel could benefit from fostering a strategy of sorts vis-a-vis the Indo-Pacific, because right now Israel gives less attention to these countries such as India and Japan than it should. And I say that in one way specifically because of what we've seen during those 13, 14 months of war that we've been having here, because both India and Japan, in different ways and to a different extent, have not been as critical of Israel as one might have expected. If we were thinking about what happened over a decade ago when Israel clashed with enemies nearby or further apart, both India and Japan would have been more critical of Israel. The strengthening of the ties between Israel and India, Israel and Japan, meant that Japan and India were much more moderate. In fact, sometimes more moderate than our immediate counterparts in Europe. And still, what we've seen is hardly any mention by the Foreign Office, meaning the minister or the prime minister, hardly any thorough engagement in order to try to mobilize more support and more public opinion support.
But these two countries might be supporting Israel more. What about one of the most influential countries in the Indo-Pacific region, being China? What is the Israeli-China relationship like, and how can they benefit that?
So the Israel-China relationship is much more
complicated.
Complicated, yeah. That's the Chinese like to say it's complicated, and not just the Chinese. It's much more complicated, specifically because despite China's attempt to say that it is a neutral country, that it has no specific alignment with either party, in practice, China kept supporting not just the Palestinians, even one could say almost Hamas, and not almost, hosting them in Beijing, including Hamas, supporting Iran, and so on and so forth. And even over the past couple of days, we've seen all kinds of statements coming from the president of China, Xi Jinping, reiterating China's understanding that a ceasefire must be reached. That in itself is not, of course, an anti-Israel stance, but also suggesting that China is all in for the Palestinian right of return, which is a very big deal, and that China is all in for the Palestinian unity. Palestinian unity includes Hamas, of course. These things for Israel are highly problematic, especially the right of return. Of course, that's an immediate threat in the way that Israel sees that. So the relationship with China are much more loaded, I would say, in these issues. And again, as long as Israel bolsters its ties with countries such as India and Japan, it helps Israel also maneuver through its relationship with China, because Israel does not want to cut off its ties with China or to turn China into an enemy. That is not something that Israel has any interest of doing.
Israel certainly wouldn't benefit from it either. Dr. Saleh, there's so much that we are unpacking here on really the broad realm, but I want us to go into a little bit more specifics quickly as we're wrapping up. We have a few more minutes, a rapid fire round, if you will. I'm going to ask some questions. Just tell me the first thought or answer that comes to your head.
That's the most difficult thing for an academic to do. Go ahead.
Going to have to boil it down here. Just the main point of contention in the region right now.
In the Indo-Pacific?
In the Indo-Pacific region.
The China-U.S. rivalry.
And how could Israel position itself as a big player, perhaps, in the Indo-Pacific region?
first have its own strategy and then try to leverage its own worth in terms of high-tech industry, in terms also of agriculture, in terms of all kinds of defense technology. I think these things can bolster Israel's stance in the Indo-Pacific.
All the benefits that Israel certainly has to offer to some of these countries.
And of course, its location. Location.
Well, so then that's one of my final questions. Does Israel prioritize these alliances enough?
I don't think so, and I think it should.
Your main recommendation, Dr. Sella, as we're wrapping up for Israel to really prioritize here, just if you could give it in a few seconds.
First of all, prioritize its relations with India, Japan, South Korea. These are main, I would say, allies that we need to consider seriously as allies and put the time and effort in order to make them understand that we regard them as such. When Israel keeps saying we are part of Western civilization, and you hear that all over the news, certainly in English, trying to convince the West, what happens in India, in Japan, and South Korea, where over half of the world population lives, and with a greater GDP than all of those rest of the Western countries.
Certainly a battle that Israel needs to possibly prioritize more, it sounds like.
We're not playing.
No, it doesn't seem like it. Dr. Ori Sella, a lot to unpack and a lot to think about, so I appreciate you taking the time to be with us on the National Security Podcast today and talking about